Begin tonight by trying to make sense of what happened this afternoon, and perhaps more importantly, why it happened, and today of all days. Look, we saw a surprise full-court press just a few hours ago from the White House on election security. It featured true heavy hitters: the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats; the Director of the FBI, Chris Wray; the President's National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who called Russia's intrusion initially an act of war; the Homeland Security Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen; and the NSA Director, Paul Nakasone. And their message was essentially the same. The threat from Russia and other rogue actors is real. The attacks are ongoing and pervasive. Our democracy is in the crosshairs. And this administration, they say, is on top of it. So, is the president? In fact, they told us the president explicitly directed them to make this a top priority and to have this briefing. But folks, it's arguably because of this president that some are wondering why exactly they chose today to have this press conference, and why the president himself wasn't there if this was so important to him. Some may wonder why they didn't hold an election security event like this immediately after Trump took office in 2017. Or they could have done it when the intelligence community reaffirmed its conclusions about Russian interference months after he took office. Imagine the entire new national security team having that event together back in March or April. Or how about when Mueller indicted 13 Russian nationals for interfering in our election, the social media? That'd have been a good day to do it. Or when Mueller indicted 12 Russian agents for hacking the DNC and the Clinton campaign. That also would have been a good day to do it. Or when the Senate Intelligence Committee issued its recommendations about election security. Or when Facebook announced it had uncovered new efforts to influence our elections. You get the drift. Again, why now? We're less than 100 days from the midterms. And why did this happen the day after the president tweeted about obstructing the Russia investigation, as his campaign chief is on trial, as his former personal attorney is making serious allegations against him, and as there's a real risk Mueller could subpoena Mr. Trump for testimony? Folks, the bottom line here is this. For some, it's going to take more than one surprise briefing to convince them that what we heard today about cracking down on Russia has the full backing of the president, and that it was not an effort by a White House communications team desperate to turn the page from the other headaches they had been asked about all week. Here's an exchange between a reporter and the FBI director, actually, on that exact question.
Why would the American people believe what you're saying about the FBI when the president says that the investigation by the special counsel is a hoax, and when the press secretary yesterday said that there was a lot of corruption within the FBI? Do you have any response to those statements coming from the White House?
Well, I can assure the American people that the men and women of the FBI, starting from the director all the way on down, are going to follow our oaths and do our jobs.
And what about that Trump-Putin press conference just 2 weeks ago, where the president sided with Putin and against the intelligence chiefs? Here's more from today's briefing.
At the press conference, the president didn't highlight any of the malign activities that you have and that his advisors have. And so, should Americans believe that he is listening to your advice, or that he is going his own way when he's having meetings like he did with the president of Russia?
I think the president has made it abundantly clear to everybody who has responsibility in this area that he cares deeply about it, and that he expects them to do their jobs to their fullest ability, and that he supports them fully.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Beat the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.